During the Great Depression, Australian church ladies created a lemon pie that contained no lemons, rissoles that never spoiled even in summer heat, and a cordial so powerful it made entire rooms of children go silent within minutes. Recipes so strange that doctors ordered them stopped and communities tried to forget they ever existed. These weren't just budget meals, they were chemical experiments born from desperation that somehow worked better than they should have. But here's what nobody wants to talk about. What exactly were our grandparents putting in our bodies when they had no other choice? And why did these recipes vanish so completely that even food historians can't explain them? Back in the Depression, Australian churches weren't just places for Sunday service. They were survival networks where women shared secrets that kept families fed when money ran dry. The Country Women's Association halls attached to rural churches became testing grounds for recipes that could feed a crowd for pennies. One recipe from a 1934 church cookbook in Tamworth became so famous that brides requested it at their weddings 40 years later, even when they could afford real lemons. Mrs. Henderson from the Presbyterian Ladies Guild discovered this recipe in her grandmother's handwritten cookbook from St. Andrew's Church in rural New South Wales. The lemon pie contained no lemons at all. Instead, it used tartaric acid from the chemist, mixed with sugar and water to create a filling that tasted remarkably like lemon curd. During the Depression, when a single lemon cost what a man earned in an hour of farm work, this chemical shortcut became a revelation. The base was even more ingenious. Stale bread, soaked in water and squeezed dry, mixed with a tiny amount of butter and sugar, then pressed into a pie tin. No pastry flour needed. The bread created a crust that held together well enough to slice but melted on your tongue. On top, the women would whip up a meringue using just egg. Whites and a pinch of cream of tartar, since sugar for proper meringue was precious. According to accounts from the National Library's oral history collection, church ladies would make dozens of these pies for community gatherings. The smell of caramelizing meringue would fill the church hall, mixing with the scent of brewing Bushells tea in the big urn. Women stood around wooden tables, their hands moving in practiced rhythm, spreading the white peaks across golden filling. What made this pie extraordinary was its democratic nature. Every family, no matter how poor, could make it. Tartaric acid cost pennies and lasted months. Stale bread was something everyone had. Eggs came from backyard chooks that kept laying even when money stopped coming in. The pie looked fancy enough for a wedding, but cost less than a loaf of fresh bread. By the 1970s, when Mrs. Henderson's daughter got married at the same church, she insisted on serving these depression pies at the reception instead of the cream cakes from the bakery. The older guests recognized them immediately. They'd grown up eating these pies at every church social, every CWA afternoon tea, every community gathering during the hard years. The younger guests had no idea they weren't eating real lemon pie. But here's what nobody talked about at that wedding reception. The recipe had a strange side effect. Something about the combination of tartaric acid and bread crust created a taste that lingered on your tongue for hours afterwards. Not unpleasant exactly, but persistent. Like the Depression itself, it was a flavor that refused to be forgotten, even when you desperately wanted to move on. Every Thursday afternoon in Brunswick during the Depression, the Methodist church basement transformed into a production line. Women from the congregation gathered to make what they called eternal rissoles, a recipe that could feed the parish's struggling families and somehow stayed fresh for days without refrigeration. Accordingly, to records from the Age newspaper archives and community cookbooks from St. Philip's Church, this recipe saved countless families from hunger. The base wasn't meat, though they called them rissoles. It was soaked bread again, mixed with grated vegetables, whatever was wilting in anyone's garden. Carrot tops that normally went to the chooks, potato peels, boiled until soft, onion scraps. The women would wring this mixture through old muslin until it formed a paste, then season it with salt and whatever herbs grew wild near the railway line. Dandelion leaves, fennel, wild garlic. But the secret ingredient came from the butcher down the road. He'd saved the drippings from his week's work: beef fat, lamb fat, pork fat all mixed together and donate it to the church. The women would heat this fat until it's smoked, then shape the vegetable paste into patties and fry them until a dark crust formed. That crust, thick with rendered fat, created a seal that somehow preserved the rissoles. Davo, who was just a boy then, remembered carrying these rissoles home wrapped in newspaper. His mum would leave them on the kitchen bench right next to the Milo tin, and they'd eat them cold for days. No ice chest needed. The fat sealed them like wax seals a letter. He described the taste as rich and meaty, even though there was barely any meat in them. The fat carried flavor from 100 different cuts the butcher had processed. The church ladies became famous for these rissoles. They'd make enormous batches every Thursday, and families would line up after the cooking session to collect their share. The smell in that basement was overwhelming. Hot fat, caramelizing vegetables, the tang of sweat from women working over hot pans in a room with no ventilation. The concrete walls would sweat moisture that dripped back into the cooking pans. According to Mrs. Wilson's account in a 1972 interview preserved in Trove, some of those rissoles lasted 2 weeks without spoiling. She kept them in a tin on the shelf, taking one whenever her children complained of hunger between meals. The fat never went rancid. The rissoles never grew mold. They just sat there, dark and heavy, waiting to be eaten. Her daughter, reading this account years later, noticed something her mother hadn't mentioned in the interview. The rissoles left a film on your fingers that wouldn't wash off with water. You needed to scrub with sand soap to get it off. And sometimes, late at night, you could smell them from across the room. Not the smell of food going off, but something else. Something that shouldn't smell like anything at all after sitting for 2 weeks in a hot Australian summer. St. Mary's Catholic Church in Adelaide had a recipe problem in 1933. The Women's Auxiliary needed to make Anzac biscuits for a fundraiser, but golden syrup cost too much, and oats were being rationed for horse feed. According to a handwritten recipe card found in the church archives, they created something that worked even better than the original, though nobody could quite explain how. The substitute for golden syrup was pure desperation. They boiled down sugar beet juice, which farmers were practically giving away since the sugar refineries had closed. This created a dark, thick syrup that tasted nothing like golden syrup. Bitter, earthy, almost medicinal. For the oats, they used what was called floor sweepings from the grain mill near Port Adelaide. Not actual sweepings, but the broken oat pieces too small to sell, mixed with dust and chaff. But they baked them anyway. What choice did they have? They pressed the mixture into rough rounds on old baking trays salvaged from the dump, then slid them into the wood-fired oven behind the church. The rector's wife, who managed the oven, kept the fire low because they couldn't afford much wood. What came out 3 hours later shouldn't have worked. The biscuits were almost black, hard as roof tiles, and left your fingers stained dark for hours. But when you bit into them and you needed strong teeth, something remarkable happened. That bitter beet syrup had caramelized into something complex and deep. The oat dust created a texture finer than any proper Anzac biscuit, almost dissolving on your tongue. They tasted like no biscuit anyone had eaten before. The fundraiser sold every single one. People came back asking for more. The recipe spread to other churches across Adelaide, then to the Adelaide Hills, then to country towns throughout South Australia. By 1935, these church Anzacs were more popular than regular ones in some areas. They cost a quarter of the price to make and somehow lasted longer without going stale. But according to records in the State Library of South Australia, something strange started happening in 1936. People reported that these biscuits, when stored in tins, would occasionally stick together overnight, not from moisture. The tins were bone dry. The biscuits would fuse into solid blocks that had to be broken apart with a hammer. And when you broke them apart, sometimes there'd be patterns in the fracture lines, geometric patterns that couldn't possibly form naturally. The church ladies stopped talking about it, but they kept making the biscuits exactly the same way, and people kept buying them. The Uniting Church in Cairns had a problem every Sunday morning in 1932. 30 hungry children in Sunday school. no money for proper refreshments, and Queensland heat that made the little ones irritable and loud. According to community records and oral histories from far north Queensland, the church secretary created a cordial recipe that solved everything, perhaps too well. The base was what grew free. Rosella flowers from the wild plants behind the church, boiled until the water turned deep crimson. Passion fruit pulp from vines that grew over the church fence, seeds and all. And here's where it got interesting. They'd add a handful of certain leaves from a tree the old Aboriginal groundskeeper pointed out. He said the leaves would make the drink stretch further and calm excited children. Nobody wrote down what tree. The recipe just said special leaves from the tall tree out back. Mrs. Patterson, who taught the youngest Sunday school class, described the cordial in a letter preserved in the John Oxley Library. She wrote that it had a flavour unlike anything else, sweet and tart simultaneously, with an aftertaste that reminded you of eucalyptus but wasn't quite that. They'd serve it in old jam jars filled from a big glass jug, diluted with water from the church tank. Children loved it. They'd drink their jars dry and ask for more. But here's what Mrs. Patterson mentioned almost as an afterthought in her letter. Within 10 minutes of drinking it, every child would go completely quiet. Not sleepy, not drugged, just calm and focused, sitting still through lessons that normally had them squirming and whispering. She wrote, "It's like a miracle. The moment they finish their cordial, they become perfect little angels." The recipe spread to other churches in tropical Queensland, Townsville, Mackay, Rockhampton. Everywhere it went, Sunday school teachers reported the same thing. The cordial made children compliant and attentive in a way that seemed almost supernatural. Parents started requesting the recipe for home use. According to a 1934 article in the Courier Mail, a doctor in Brisbane became concerned when a parent mentioned the cordial. He asked for a sample, tested it, and wrote an urgent letter to the churches using the recipe. That letter has been lost, but minutes from a regional church meeting mentioned discontinuing the Sunday cordial due to medical advice, effective immediately. Most churches stopped making it, but a few in remote areas where the doctor's warning never reached kept serving it through the 1940s and even into the 1950s. In a 1973 interview, a man named Terry, who grew up in a tiny church outside Mareeba, remembered the taste perfectly. He said he'd spend the whole week looking forward to Sunday school, not for the Bible stories, but for that cordial. He remembered the silence that would fall over the room after everyone drank their share, and he remembered something else. Sometimes, in that quiet room, all the children would turn their heads at exactly the same moment, as if they'd all heard the same sound that wasn't there.